We're sitting here at the Australian Temporary Embassy, in the midst of an exhibition devoted to the Breville Culinary Journey, which is a collaboration between the National Museum of Australia and Breville, the famous Australian appliance maker. It's rather a unique thing. It's, to my mind, completely out there. Once you see the toasters and coffee makers with Aboriginal designs on the side, you will never feel that you can go back to the old, shiny metal one again. So I'm sitting here with the two masterminds behind the project, Alison Page and Margo Neale. We're going to have to just basically start at the beginning, and I'm going to ask you, Alison, how did this Breville collaboration start, and when did it start? I believe quite a long time ago.
Yeah, this is one of those stories that it still makes me laugh when I think about it today, because, and you will know as well, like in the 90s and the 2000s, and even into the 2010s, anyone who's working in the Aboriginal cultural sector, we were sort of course we were champions for this beautiful culture of ours, world's oldest living culture, multi-art form, steeped in traditional knowledges, this deep coherence with nature. So, we thought it was pretty good, but in a way, I sort of felt really earnest back then, trying to convince people that this was really worth knowing more about and understanding. And so I met, so it was 16 years ago, I met the head designer.
A mere 16 years.
Just a mere 16 years ago. He'd only been in the job for about a week, Richard Hoare, who actually is a brilliant industrial designer. And, at the time, Breville was quite a small company. I think there was only like 2 people in the design department. Like now there's, like 100 people in the design department. So, we had this very enthusiastic, passionate conversation at this wedding in Margaret River. Oh, you should really do this. And we got so excited. But, it just wasn't the right time for them. It wasn't the right time for the world. It just wasn't the right time.
Yeah, we landed firmly on its rear.
Yeah, but I think, and I use this analogy often, that you plant a seed and the seed lays in the soil, and if the weather is right, that seed can germinate,
Well, if you think about, say, Brooke Andrews' Indigenous Biennale, he did the Biennale of Sydney, where he brought together artists from Mozambique and Haiti and all sorts of out-of-the-way places, artists that don't normally get into these big shows. That was an idea that had to find its time.
Yeah.
Because I would have liked to have seen an Indigenous Biennale 10 years before that,
of course,
just suitably acknowledge Australia's relationship with the Indigenous cultures of the world.
Yeah.
But now, of course, it's almost de rigueur.
Yeah.
It's gone from being a very marginal idea to one that is overwhelmingly present in almost every major institution.
Mm.
So to say that the time is now is it's a mere understatement. I mean, this is absolutely the time for stuff like this.
Yeah.
The fact that it's in embassies, and this is establishment, right?
Mm.
So we're talking about a sort of a brand new idea, a new proposal about appliances with fine art on it, and for a lot of people to marry those two concepts is a difficult thing. But the fact that we're here in an embassy, in this case in Washington, plus many other embassies around the world in absolute establishment territory means, there's something right for the time. And
it was remarkable. I mean, Richard Hoare must be one of the absolutely central people behind the whole thing. If he could hang on to that idea for that long and keep coming back to it and eventually convince everybody at the company that they wanted to do it. And then what's impressive is the fact that after the idea got up, how thoroughly they did it.
Yes.
Because it's not just a matter of sticking some Aboriginal designs on the side of a toaster. It's a much more elaborate process, was it not?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's part of the reason why they didn't say yes to it 16 years ago. And it still took 3 years to do it right. As you know, these things take time. But we had to kind of be the tonic that would cure all of those terrible projects that had been done before that had ripped off our people. You know, the horrible souvenirs, all of that stuff which people have in their mind.
The cultural appropriation by big international companies making lots of money. So they had to move into a market like that, but at an ethical position that market.
Well, we had a complete change of mentality. I mean, remember when they just plucked David Maloney's design and stuck it on the dollar note.
Exactly.
And they just thought it was, a work by an anonymous Aboriginal artist.
That's right.
And, until finally it was identified, this man has a name and it's David Maloney.
Yeah.
In those days, it didn't even occur to people at the highest echelons to do these things, whereas now we're very, very conscious.
Well, we were a homogenised people then. We were not, which will lead very closely into where we are now in terms of having a voice. But can I just comment on the thing I like about the Breville thing? When I'm from the National Museum of Australia, we endorsed the product and we put it within a context like this, which we can talk about. But what really got me is that from your original telling was that you were surprised that the product Breville was an Australian company, right? All Australian. I mean, what Australia? Vegemite's even gone, for God's sake. All the company, all those really Australian things have become multinational. First of all, that was the first point. And then you said, well, if you're Australian, is this correct? If you're an Australian company, don't you think you should put some original Australian branding on your product? Which is, in fact, what I liked about the whole thing is that this is a positioning in the market as an Australian product. That's Breville's thing. And then it comes, well, what are we actually doing with this branding in terms of Indigenous culture? Well, we're wrapping it in country. That's what we're doing. These aren't designs, these aren't decorations, these are serious people's chukapa or dreaming, and these products, it doesn't matter whether it's on a piece of canvas on the wall which you can't touch and breathe on and have to, step a metre away from, to fine art wrapped around products that are going to be in the heart of everyone's home and everyone's going to touch them, probably smell them because it looks so real you'll never know whether it's the original or not, and they can touch them all they like, and everyone is no doubt, every person will go to anyone's home and sees any of these, they will absolutely ask heaps of questions. What are they? Where do they come from? Whose are they?
They're talking points.
Totally. They're portals into Indigenous knowledges.
I mean, it's like having the most amazing designer implement in your kitchen that somebody would come in and say, "Oh wow, where did you get this
from?
What's this? Who did this?"
Yes.
And you wrote about Breville being an Australian company, and that why does it shock us that an Australian company does something? I mean, the fact is that when you look around, you realise that all the big name Australian companies, the Australian companies that were the major companies for the 20th century, have all been sold off to overseas conglomerates. I mean, Kiwi boot polish, Arnott's biscuits, everything is owned. And what Breville are doing here, I mean, the fact that Breville have been able to expand the business so radically in about 20 years and become an international corporation as opposed to just an Australian-based one is impressive in its own right. But it's very rare, I think, that for an Australian manufacturer to go internationally like that. Rather, it's the opposite way around. I mean, it's hard for us to even convince people in Australia that the Australian product is the thing they want. There's a glamour associated with the overseas product. But I think what Breville have done with this range is to really reverse that flow. So now they're creating something distinctively Australian, could come from nowhere else, looks amazing, and it's the sort of thing you could put it up alongside the rather sleek products of the European corporations and say, hey, this is really a choice. This is something where I can think, do I want something that makes a statement like this? Because we talk in advertising and branding, all the rest of it, about making statements, about expressing your identity, etc., etc. Yeah. Well, in this case, you can.
If you think about it, Australian design is 65,000 years old. There was never, and within that, if you look at the design of a boomerang or a coolaman or any of these tools for living that we have around us, they are beautifully aesthetic, they're sustainable, they're functional, they're wonderfully, very sophisticated in their function, and then the final part of it which I think is the sort of gift in a way of Aboriginal culture to Australian design generally, is that it brings this storytelling element, this art element into those tools for living, because of course on a function, part of the function of the object is the art, is to activate the library of the dreaming, is to activate all of that ecological knowledge. And so in a way, if Australian design has that continuum over millennia, then Breville are just taking their place.
I'll be devil's advocate here. What are you going to say when people say, aren't you making rather a big deal about toasters and coffee makers? I mean, isn't there something a bit inherently sort of kitschy about doing all this stuff with kitchen appliances and then saying it's an artistic triumph? I mean, that is the sort of reaction you're going to get. And is it just sheer snobbery? Do we have to reevaluate the way we approach these things?
Can I just say, let's just take it back a step. The reason me as a representative of the NMA, being the Indigenous advisor there, the reason I really had no trouble with endorsing them, and it's a big step for all the reasons you just intimated, is because Aboriginal people have been mark making on the tools for living for millennia, and this is simply an extension of that. Now, if you look around you in this room, you'll see marks on the baskets. These are all tools for living. There's the boomerangs for bringing down the game. There's the coolamans for grinding the seeds to make the damper, which is, in today's terms, the bread, which pops into this little toaster here. And then there's the fire sticks over here, for making the fire, which is the heating devices in the oven that's over here. So first of all, there's this absolute relationship in functionality between the objects, the artefacts of yesteryear, and still done today in some places, and these modern so-called contemporary appliances. So what you've got is this continuum of a dynamic history of a culture that adapts to the times. They made marks on the tools for living then, make marks on the tools for living now, and they then become cultural, these once ordinary objects are now cultural ambassadors.
Let me sort of flesh that out a little bit. I can see sort of two ways we could go with this. When we're talking about these appliances, we're basically just talking about a more sophisticated sort of high-tech version of whatever kitchen was going on in the outback, thousands of years ago, when you were preparing food and catching around the fire and so on. It's a different style of implement. On the other hand, when we're talking about materials, we're thinking about something like, say, Gunbi Ganamba up in Yirrkala, who has said, well, why do we have to do our larrakitch on a wooden tree trunk? Why can't we do it on a PVC pipe?
Or a metal, or a rubber from the conveyor belts in the mining fields.
Why can't we carve a traditional design into a great slab of rubber from the conveyor belt of the bauxite mine? And of course, there's absolutely no reason why they can't. It's just that nobody thought of it before, and we had this kind of idea, this very purist idea, that Aboriginal art has to all be done on bark with ochres and by deeply spiritual people. And now we find we can. The
rain tanks,
Well, in fact, let's be real. That idea sort of perpetuates this sort of ethnographic romanticism of Aboriginal people, because, of course, country and our definition of country, which is land, sea, sky, it includes all the things we make and build. So when we make anything and bring it into country, it's part of that same process of mark making and expression of our library of the dreaming. And so we know, in the last 250 years, as glass came into country, as steel came into metal, that it was incorporated very quickly, because efficacy is what all cultures, there was, I often think though, why didn't Aboriginal people, surely someone must have thrown a bit of clay in the fire, but of course it would have made them too sedentary. they had to move
They
around.
only the small, like the skull caps, little things you could leave behind.
Correct.
You don't transport
So that's
anything.
not
They
to
didn't want to
say
drag
that they
anything
just
around.
kind of went.
Like the grinding stone,
They were great travellers. They were great light packers.
like packers.
From place to place, they didn't want to lug around a whole lot of pottery.
But this is about values. And back to your, you made this great point, Margo, about, here's fine art on canvas. This is, objects that you use every day. That the hierarchy of value, of objects and where they sit, and you could probably include the built environment, that architecture into that,
Yes.
or interior design into that. And, and funnily enough, the high-end, art market is more about interior design than ever, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
But that is a construct that I don't think Aboriginal people really subscribe to.
They don't get it. I mean, I don't get it, and I'm a concrete Koori like you, and live in the city, but I still don't get the hierarchy. I don't get the sense of, as you know, in fine art, canvas is considered more important than watercolours and paper and so on and so on. I know it's changing, but it's very deeply embedded, and it's that sort of thinking that the fine art specialists of today would have some difficulty with these, because they, knowingly or not, see these as ordinary things in an ordinary kitchen. So they would find it very hard to see that as a surface for fine art.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Blackfellas don't at all.
Blackfellas are much more adaptable in many ways, as we
They
know.
just don't have the hierarchy like that.
They don't have those hierarchies. They don't have the same priorities. I mean, and by and large in the communities, they're not hung up on money and status and things that are. When they've got their own hierarchies inside
yes,
communities. But it's not as if, hey, I've got a fabulous Rolex or I'm driving a flash car or something.
Yeah.
That's not part of the equation at all. One could look at these and you could argue that in fact they're kind of like limited edition prints. It's
Yeah. They are.
It's just that the print is really part of an appliance rather than a flat piece of paper on a wall.
Talk about utilitarianism. Look at the objects around here. That's exactly what they're about. So form follows function, the form follows function, the fine art follows the form. They're very functional. So the kitchens of yesterday did that, used those sorts of appliances, but our kitchens changed. So now we use these sorts of appliances. And if you just add the extra value added, fine art piece as well, then mate, you can't get better than
But in
that.
design terms, the designs actually are fitted to the sides, to the wraparounds. You feel as though there's a real sense, a kind of a haptic sense, where the actual designs somehow attach themselves organically to these devices.
You can tell them about how, I think that's a perfect point for you to make about when you actually gave them the appliances.
Yeah.
They took truckloads and thought they'd have to practice and get it right. What happened?
Well, the first thing we had to do, because, these artists are some of the best contemporary artists in the world. We're talking about Wallampiri Japinjari, Yalti and Yukulchi Napangadi, who are 3 members of the Pintupi Nine. This is a group of people who walked out of the desert in the 80s and saw white man for the first time. So their arts practice, it's even funny to call it that, really, but their cultural expression is extremely potent. And so for me, selecting those artists particularly was a no-brainer. And also the other artist is Lucy Simpson, who is trained as a designer. She went to the College of Fine Arts, but she's sort of specialised in design. And she's done some extremely beautiful contemporary work. She lives in Sydney. So we wanted to sort of show in the selection of the artists that there is this breadth of expression in Aboriginal art in Australia, from, this sort of ancient storytelling through to these contemporary artists. But so a huge part of the challenge of doing that was, of course, you're going to as one of Australia's most remote communities, and so we had to take heaps of juicers and coffee machines just to introduce them to these objects. So we had to cook breakfast for everyone one morning, which is really lovely. It was so lovely.
It's ritual.
And this is why, that was really important, because it's why You know, as a curator, I didn't really have to do anything, you know. Yalti immediately started painting on the kettle about women sitting around the waterhole drinking the Pirawa tea. And so, you know, Yalti also saw the juicer as the medicine machine. And, you know, Lucy paints about ancient grains and the grinding of native grains on the toaster, and the oven's about fire stick farming, and so that's an ecological map wrapped around the oven. And then of course Wallumpiri has the men's ceremonial coffee machine, and then we've got the women's ceremonial coffee machine. So even though I'm the curator, I'm just kind of like, I didn't even really influence any of those decisions. No. It was totally just left to the artists, and of course they completely got it.
Yeah, but as, the shape, they just felt the shape and worked to the shape.
But I mean, I think
and
what it does also is all Aboriginal art, really, all Aboriginal art from the remote communities is a gift. I mean, you talk to the artists, and one of the things they will say is they want to do something that, you know, talks about their culture, shows their culture, does something for the white fellas. Yeah. So it's like, you know, we sit here and we hear all this stuff about how we've got to live and get all these devices and we have to live in this way, in this culture that the white fella has put on top of us. But we'd like them just to have something back, to see our culture.
Exactly.
And to see that, you know, we have a whole, you know, deep bunch of things that we think about that are important to us, and here it is. Yeah. And like, how could you do it more effectively than put it on an appliance and give it to all those white fellas
eating and drinking,
to put in their kitchens in the morning? I mean, every time you look at one of these devices, you're going to think, oh, well, I know I've got a very strong sense of where we are in this country and who was here first.
Yeah. And this is where, you know, this is very much a perfect example of reconciliation. I mean, in its basis terms, reconciliation is working well together, right? Different cultural groups, in this case, white and black Australians. Well, what a better example could you get?
Well, I mean,
based on what you said, but the fact that, you know, we're bringing a sort of a Western material concept as in terms of these types of utilitarian objects, and gifting it to them to do their ceremony or wrapping them in country to give back to us, to put in the hearts of our homes, so that we are forever, you know, connected, responding and connecting to country. So that's, I can't think of a better way of expressing what this does in those terms.
You know, this project really comes back to the very basic compulsion that all Aboriginal people have, which is to give voice to their cultural values, to the library of the dreaming, to truth. You know, we're going to see a lot more of our art projects dealing with Australia's true history, and our shared history, which I think is really interesting. And so this notion of voice to me is actually, I think, in a way, the gift really that, you know, I mean, I think what I'm excited about with what's happening in the cultural sector in Australia is the fact that I think Australia is finally mature enough to see that Aboriginal culture is this amazing gift, and we should put it as central to the national identity.